Good evening, everybody. Goedenavond en welkom voor onze lezing met Lahav Harkov over de Israëlische politiek. De actualiteit rond de Israëlische politiek. Mijn naam is Judean, directeur van CIDI en ik heet u allen welkom. We wachten nog heel even dat mevrouw Harkov zich ook aansluit bij deze bijeenkomst. Ik weet dat ze er is. Rico, misschien kun jij haar even aansluiten bij de bijeenkomst. Ja. Good evening, Lahav. I already started introducing this lecture, yes. But I was missing you, so now you're with us. Welcome. Thanks for joining us tonight. I have already said welcome to our audience, and I would like to introduce Lahav Harkov, Ms. Lahav Harkov, very shortly. Lahav Harkov is an Israeli, born in the US. She has lived in Israel for quite a while now, and she's worked for Jerusalem Post as a reporter, a diplomatic reporter, and an editor of the Jerusalem Post. We have had a long history of cooperation with CIDI and Lahav, and last year we also discussed some of Israel's politics, and now we are very happy that Lahav has agreed to tell us a bit about background and what led to the current situation of the Israeli politics and what is coming next. Lahav will talk for about half an hour, a bit longer, after which we will open the floor for questions and answers. Whoever wants to pose their questions on Zoom, you can use the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen, and you can just type your question, which I will look. And please keep your questions short so I can structure them and pose them to Lahav. On Facebook, where we are also at the moment, you can also ask your questions and they will be passed to me so I can pose them again to Lahav. Lahav, the floor is yours.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for being here. So I'm here to speak to you about the election coming up in Israel. And really right now, as we speak, there's discussions going on in the Knesset towards the bill to disperse the Knesset. And that'll call an election. At this point, the election date is supposed to be November 1st, but there's still sort of some debate about that. And it may be a week earlier. Now, how did we get here? There's the sort of broad answer and the narrow answer. So I'm going to start with the narrow answer and then broaden out. And I'm assuming a certain level of knowledge of who the big players and who the parties are, because I have about half an hour to speak to you, and I probably need a full hour to get into all of that. But if you don't understand, if I am assuming knowledge that people don't have, then please flag it to me, and I'm happy to explain more thoroughly. So anyway, I'm gonna the narrow explanation that I'm starting with is with this government. So a year ago, this coalition was formed that's about to officially fall apart, and it was, many said, the most diverse coalition in Israel's history. We had a prime minister, Naftali Bennett, from a small party called Yamina, which was to the right of Likud, right? Likud being the main right-wing party. So they were considered very solidly right-wing, even far right. And that was on one end of this coalition. And then you had Meretz, which is the far left for Israel. I would say probably equivalent to a lot of European Green parties. And they were on the left. And then in addition to having this range of right to left in the coalition, you also had a Ra'am, which is a party that was based on the Islamist movements in Israel. So these are very religious Muslims, very socially conservative on the one hand, and on the other hand, when it comes to issues of war and peace and Palestinian issues, their positions are what's considered the left in Israel, associated with the left wing in Israel. And so you could say almost their platform is, they relate to different sides of the political spectrum in Israel on different issues. So you had this very broad coalition, and there were 8 different parties really running, as I said, running the gamut from left to right. And you had Bennett, who I said he leads a small party. Now, we should focus on that because I think people don't speak about that enough. This was the first time in Israel's history that you had a prime minister from a small party. It had happened in the past that there were prime ministers that were not from the largest party in the Knesset, but they were always the second largest. Always. There was one other time, and it was Likud and it was Netanyahu, and Likud had 1 seat less than Kadima. This was in 2009. So you did not have a situation where you had a party with more than 30 seats in the Knesset, which is what Likud has now, and a party that won 7 seats, and the party with the 7 seats is the one that the prime minister comes from. And I think this made Bennett a weak prime minister from the get-go. It opened him to questions of his legitimacy, and it made it harder for him to sort of put his foot down and establish government policy, because within his coalition, I mean, Likud was not in the coalition, right? Likud is in the opposition in this government, but still within his coalition, the power dynamic was not such that the prime minister was as powerful as he should be normally in a governing coalition. Now, the reason that someone with such a small party, 7 out of the 61 seats in the coalition, 61 when they got started, they lost that majority, and I'll get to that. But the reason someone with only 7 seats became prime minister was essentially this coalition would not have existed without Bennett. Bennett was on the fence whether to join this diverse coalition or to go with Netanyahu and form a right-wing coalition, which Netanyahu didn't actually have the numbers to have a majority. So in the end, it wasn't that much of a choice, because what was Bennett? He would join Netanyahu and there would still be another election. Whereas in this coalition, there wasn't an election for a year. But Bennett's condition was that he had to be prime minister so that he can make sure that things aren't too left-wing in his perception. And I think people can debate whether that actually worked for him or not. I don't think, in certain policies, it was more left-wing, and other policies, it was more right-wing, and it's pretty subjective. In any case, so that's Bennett. That's one weakness of this coalition. The other weakness, Bennett and others in the coalition really love to present this as like this beautiful rainbow that they created of all the different colors, the spectrum, the Israeli spectrum, all working together towards a common goal. And that's a very nice idea, and I support it in theory for sure. Who doesn't want peaceful and tolerant coexistence for people of all different ideas and opinions in Israel, right? And Bennett would give the example of people of all different political opinions work together in the army. And you can even say Jews and Arabs, because is a representative or has a very strong voter base among Bedouins, and there are thousands of Bedouins who serve in the IDF. So really, the example of the IDF is a good one, that people of all different views and backgrounds serve together. Also, in offices in different places around the country, people who come from different backgrounds work together. And so Bennett said, if they could do it there, we could do it here in our government. And he also went around the world talking about this. You listen to his speeches to world leaders, his speech to the UN, comments when he was in the UK and met with Boris Johnson and other people. And he would say that this government was an example. Now, you might hear some skepticism in my voice. And that's because the people who are paying attention to how this government functioned knew that it was dysfunctional from the beginning. Did they manage to get some important things done? Yes, they passed a budget for the first time in 3 years, which is very important. They helped, get unemployment down and economic growth up again after a pandemic. They got us through the end of Delta and all of Omicron without having another lockdown. And there are other things as well. For those who care about religion and state issues, there was a reform in kosher certification that I don't think a usual right-wing government would have been able to do, because the Haredi, the ultra-Orthodox parties, would have been in the coalition and blocked it. So they did get things done, but there was a lot of fighting about very big and important issues, security issues. Maybe security isn't the right definition, but sort of settlement issues having to do with Palestinians, issues having to do with Jerusalem and the status of Jerusalem. And these fights were ongoing. barely a week went by that they weren't fighting about these serious issues. So there were really problems from the get-go. And in the end, it seemed almost naive to think that there could be a coalition that was only going to focus on domestic issues, which is what they said in the beginning, and not on these broader issues that are an issue, that they come up all the time in Israel. There's this government may not have been interested in war, but war is interested in Israel, unfortunately. And we haven't had a war in the last year. It's been a relatively peaceful year. And yet we also had a wave of terrorism. We also had rioting on the Temple Mount. And so it seems that no government can really avoid those issues. And the bottom line was that this government was built on a very weak foundation, right? At the end of the day, what did all these parties have in common? What do Labor and Meretz have in common with Yamina and Avigdor Lieberman's Yisrael Beitenu party? In the end, what they had in common was that they didn't want to sit in a coalition with Bibi. And that may have been strong enough glue to bring this coalition together, but it wasn't strong enough glue for them to last for a long time and to last for a year. Now, why did the coalition fall apart now, if I said they've been fighting for a year? Well, the first sort of stone to come loose from the wall, well, maybe not the first. The very first was immediately when this coalition was formed. A member of Bennett's party, his name is Amichai Shikli, he decided he's not going to be part of this coalition. He's not going to vote with the coalition. That was less important. They still had a majority at this point. It was a 1-seat majority. They had 61 seats, but they managed for 10 months with the 61 seats with all the drama that I had already mentioned. But the real stone that sort of fell from this wall that started the avalanche was in April, when a Knesset member from Bennett's party named Idit Silman, she decided that she's leaving and she's not voting with the coalition anymore. She can't stand it anymore. And her reason that she stated was basically there had been a Supreme Court ruling that people can bring bread into hospitals on Passover. So the hospital food in Israel is kosher, or at least public hospitals. And they asked people not to bring their own food to keep the hospital kosher for Passover. And some people sued. They wanted to, people who want to eat bread, want to have a sandwich, want to be able to bring it into the hospital so they could eat the food that they're comfortable with. And it ended up going all the way to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court said you have to let people bring their own food. So the health minister, Nitzan Horowitz, who's from the Meretz party, which is really for separating religion and state in Israel, like really wants strong, big changes and strong reforms on that subject, he decided he's going to enforce the Supreme Court ruling. And she gave that as her reason. Now, honestly, this whole story about bread on Passover is not super important politically because it sort of seemed like an excuse at the time. There was massive political pressure on her and really everybody who's considered right-wing in this coalition, from the majority of the right wing in Israel, which if you look at polls, only a very, very small number of voters support the three sort of right-wing parties in this coalition. Far more people support Likud and the parties, Likud's current satellite parties, which are all Orthodox parties. And there's been some truly ugly talks and attitudes. And I am not characterizing the Israeli right as ugly, don't get me wrong. But there has been very, very ugly language on social media, calling Bennett like sort of a thief, that he stole the premiership, that they support terrorists because they're sitting in a coalition with Arabs, and especially right-wing people in this coalition who live in like small towns, very homogeneous communities. They have faced a lot of pressure, including people in their synagogues coming up to them and shouting at them, or people shouting at their children in school and things like that. And to me, it seems that she eventually succumbed to that pressure. We also know that she had pressure inside her home, that her own husband was a Likud supporter and would write about it in social media, and that felt that this government wasn't legitimate. So it seems that there was just a ton of this public and political pressure on her, and that's why she left. And just the immediate issue on the agenda was this bread on Passover. Anyway, when Idit Silman left the coalition, it was left with 60 seats. And it was left in this shaky situation for about 2 months. The immediate cause that really led to this coalition falling apart is something called the Judean Samara regulation. For those who don't know, Judean Samaria is the historic and biblical name of the West Bank. And every 5 years since 1967, these regulations have been renewed by the Knesset. They, to very little fanfare. Most people don't even know they exist. It just happens. It always passes. The vast majority of the Knesset votes in favor, including people who don't necessarily like settlements, and the Arabs and Emirates vote against. And that was usually the situation. Now, what this law says that needs to be renewed every 5 years, it allows Israeli civil law to apply to Israeli citizens living in Judea and Samaria. So they get the health insurance that all Israeli citizens have. They're able to vote. They have to pay taxes. If they have to go to court for some reason, then they are tried in a normal Israeli civil court as opposed to a military court. So all of these just like really basic legal things governing a normal citizen's life, in order for them to apply to Israelis who live there in Judea and Samaria, in the settlements, this has to be renewed every 5 years. Its deadline is in 2 days. And the coalition did not have the votes, and they were trying really hard. They did not have a majority in the Knesset. Likud refused to vote in favor. Now, Likud is very pro-settlement. If you remember, it was only 2 years ago that Netanyahu wanted to annex all of the settlements, right? He wanted them to fall fully under Israeli law without the need for renewing this every 5 years. And then he backed down because it was a condition of the Abraham Accords. So ideologically, Likud is in favor of this and in favor of going even further than this. But politically, Netanyahu took a bet that if he sort of plays chicken with Bennett, if he refuses to vote in favor of this law and it doesn't have a way of passing, then this government will fall. And that's what happened. Bennett last week got up and gave a speech and said that he's not going to plunge the country into chaos. He just doesn't have the votes for this, and that he's going to call an election. Now, the reason calling an election helps is because if the Knesset is not in session when this law expires, it's automatically renewed until the Knesset is in session again, which means until after an election. So that sort of saves the day until we have a more stable political situation, which God only knows when we'll have that. So that's the sort of immediate cause based on the last year of this election. Now, the broader cause, which I've sort of hinted at when I talked about Netanyahu's behavior when it comes to the Judea and Samaria regulations, right? Netanyahu has a certain ideology, certain beliefs that he has presented and talked about for decades. He doesn't have a perfect record, right? He voted in favor of the disengagement from Gaza, so that's not necessarily a pro-settlement vote. But overall, very, very in favor of Israelis in Judea and Samaria. And despite that, despite what he seems to honestly believe, he wouldn't vote in favor of it. Now, to me, that represents politics over ideology. And especially in Israel, in the past few years, we are about to be on our fifth election in 3.5 years. It's become personal politics over ideology. And when I say personal, it's about one person. It's about Netanyahu. Yes, Bibi, no Bibi. Now, this was also true of the 2015 elections, to be honest. And it's been the big question about Israeli politics, but it's just engulfed and encompassed everything now for so long. And it started with the first of these 5 elections back in the beginning of 2019. It was April 2019 was the first election. During that election season, Netanyahu was indicted on several corruption counts, but he continued running for prime minister, which is legal in Israel, and it's intentionally legal. It's not a loophole. The reason it's other ministers, if they're indicted, if they're charged with a crime, and they have to go show up to court and fight to prove their innocence or not, they have to resign. But the prime minister doesn't, because the Knesset decided, and this was 20 years ago already, and hasn't been changed, that it shouldn't be that the attorney general can make such a huge, one individual person, the attorney general, can make such a huge decision for the whole country. That's a decision that should be made democratically. So that's the sort of logic behind that law. However, basically everyone not on the right thought that Netanyahu should resign. And he's under indictment on charges of bribery, breach of trust, and on multiple counts of these things. It could take an hour just to explain his court cases, so I'm not going to get into them. If you have a specific question, I can answer, but they've been ongoing over the past few years. So anyway, everyone not on the right basically thinks that Netanyahu should resign, even if the law doesn't require it. On the right, there's a small group. There's a party called New Hope, led by Gideon Sa'ar, who is was a rival of Netanyahu's in Likud and ended up breaking off from the party. And he also believes that it's wrong for someone under indictment to run for prime minister or to be prime minister. So, but that party didn't exist yet in the first of these 5 elections. Back then, there was a majority for the right wing. After that first election, there were 65 right-wing seats in the Knesset. Avigdor Lieberman, the head of Yisrael Beitenu, he refused to have his party sit in a coalition with Netanyahu, ostensibly for policy reasons. He didn't want to be in a government with the ultra-Orthodox, the Haredi parties, for different policy reasons, which he acted on that policy. Now he's finance minister and he's enacted certain policies, basically encouraging people to have to go to work in order to get certain social benefits. So, you can't say it's total, you can't say he's lying about it. It is something that he wanted to do. But anyway, one of his reasons is he didn't want to be in a coalition with the ultra-Orthodox. The other is he didn't think Netanyahu was tough enough on Hamas. He had been defense minister until late 2018 under Netanyahu. And he had other demands. But ultimately, it seemed that he really just didn't want to be in a coalition with Netanyahu as prime minister. He really didn't negotiate with Netanyahu in any serious way. And Netanyahu was left without a majority, without Lieberman. He only had 60 seats, not 61. He just couldn't get the votes to form a coalition. And so he called another election. And this put us into this cycle where people who were boycotting Netanyahu, arguably for justifiable reasons, right? Because he's on trial, which I think is, whether you agree with it or not, I think is a fair argument. It put this situation, this cycle where where there weren't governments being formed until our 3rd election out of this 5. Now, the personal politics issue can also be put on Netanyahu, right? Why didn't Netanyahu resign if he saw that no government could be formed as long as he was still in office, right? You could say that it's an ego issue, that he's putting himself before the country. These are arguments that people have been making. And there were, for a long time, until this government in the last year was formed, huge protests outside the prime minister's residence calling for him to resign. Netanyahu would argue that he won a Democratic primary to lead the Likud party, which he did by a huge majority, and that Likud, with him at the helm, consistently gets more seats than any other party. And so the people want him. This is a democracy. Why should he have to resign, right? So that's the argument that's happening. But in the end of the day, the political argument, more than anything else, more than, economic policy of the Palestinians, security policy over Iran, Hezbollah, Gaza, any number of issues we have, instead of that, the argument, the subtext, and really just the text, not the subtext, is to Bibi or not to Bibi. And so it's become which I think is really, it's unfortunate. And it's also created this situation where it's very hard to form any kind of stable coalition because people are not working together on actual ideological and policy lines that will allow them to govern Israel long term. So this is the obstacle that we need to overcome now, whether it's on Netanyahu's side to resign or on the other side, really the moderate right-wing parties, because the parties on the left it's not relevant for them, but to overcome their personal opposition to Netanyahu in order to govern, to just hold their noses and govern, or for Netanyahu to hold his nose and quit. So Hannah didn't want me to speak for too long. I think I've clocked in at less than half an hour. And that's where we are politically, and I think I can answer your questions.
Thank you very much, Lahav. I would like to start with the first question. By the way, I'm repeating again, for those who want to pose questions, there is this Q&A button on the bottom of your screen, which you could press and then just type your question, and I will see that. But Lahav, maybe you could elaborate a bit more about the Ra'am, about the Arab country, party and its game with Likud, with the Bibi camp and the no Bibi camp.
Sure. So Ra'am is one of the few parties, and I would say Naftali Bennett's Yamina party was the other party that they weren't playing this yes Bibi, no Bibi game. They weren't in the tank with Bibi and saying we're only with Bibi, and they weren't saying we are boycotting Bibi. And that made sort of the two of them the kingmakers of the last election. But Ra'am is of course very unique in the fact that they're an Arab party willing to join an Israeli governing coalition, something that has not happened in about 50 years. And when it happened 50 years ago, these were parties that were sort of subsidiaries of the Labor Party. And in this case, it's a totally independent political party. In late 2020, more or less, Mansour Abbas, the leader of Ra'am, decided that he was going to take a different approach for the rest of the Arab parties who had joined together in a bloc called the Joint List, where he was going to put domestic issues, the domestic needs of his constituents over sort of the Palestinian nationalism issues. It doesn't mean that he doesn't agree with those other parties on Palestinian nationalist issues. He, for the most part, does, but he decided to prioritize things like infrastructure, education, fighting crime. There's been a huge, huge spike in crime in the Arab sector in recent years. And he wanted the resources and the political power to be able to better the everyday lives of the people of Israeli Arabs. And he started by, I mean, Netanyahu was prime minister at the time, right? It was in between elections. I believe it was between elections 3 and 4, but there might have been discussions earlier. And he started to discuss with Netanyahu concrete things and saying, you know, if you give us funding for this, or if you increase police presence in this town, then I will vote with you on this or that issue. And it helped that they're very conservative. So on things that, for example, the Haredi parties supported, domestic issues, they tended to also Ra'am. So there were ways that they were really willing to cooperate with the right wing on domestic issues. And Likud, senior members of Likud negotiated with Ra'am after the 4th election to join a coalition led by Netanyahu, or to be sort of outside the coalition, but vote with the coalition in a sort of unofficial, but still agreed upon framework. It didn't work out at the end because they're the party on the farthest right in Israel. They're called the Religious Zionist Party. They refused to send a coalition with him. They said that he's not Zionist. They said and still say that he supports terrorists, which, you know, he does things that are perhaps unpalatable to most Israelis. You know, he's visited Palestinian terrorists, and members of his party have visited Palestinian terrorists when they've been released from prison, have like attended their parties for being released and things like that. But to say that he actually supports terrorism is false, but that's what they're campaigning on right now. And so Bibi couldn't form a coalition. He just didn't have the numbers. He needed a Religious Zionist Party and he needed Ra'am at the same time, and he couldn't have it. So Ra'am ended up going with the other coalition because they weren't wedded to Bibi. They would join any coalition that was willing to address the issues that their voters care about. And so they joined the Bennett coalition and thus became the first Israeli Arab party in about 50 years that was really willing to be part of a coalition. Now, the reason the other parties were not is that they, because of the quote unquote occupation, right? That's what they call it, that they don't want to be sort of complicit in the way that Israel's policies towards the Palestinians, and they feel that Israel is, you know, that is not legitimate.
So the point is that there are two parties who could join the two blocks, the yes baby, no baby blocks, both. And these are Yamina on the one hand and Ra'am on the other.
Well, that was the case in the fourth election. Now that we're coming up in the fifth election, it's probably true of Ra'am, except that Likud is now rejecting them. Once Ra'am joined the Bennett coalition, Likud members, and including Netanyahu himself, have made a big fuss about, we don't support Ra'am, they support terrorists, they're not Zionists, etc. And then the issue with Yamina is, I am not certain, that I think chances are pretty low that they'll exist for this fifth election. We kind of have to wait and see if Bennett is going to stay in politics or not, which he has not decided yet, and then whether his party stays intact after if he leaves.
Okay, and maybe a few words about Yamina, who was created before the first of those four elections. And
Yamina was created for the second election, I believe it was. In the first election, Bennett had a different party named the New Right, which didn't pass the threshold. But basically, Bennett had traditionally been the head of what was historically called the National Religious Party. By the time Bennett won their first ever primary election in 2012, they were called the Bayit Yehudi, the Jewish Home Party. They were a religious Zionist party. Eventually, he didn't like being held down by the party apparatus. He also wanted a party that was mixed religious and secular. He didn't only want a religious party. He wanted something very solidly right-wing, pro-Judean Samaria, but at the same time, not all religious. And so he broke off and formed this new party, the New Right, and then eventually Yamina. There ended up being a lot of sort of wasted votes because some of his religious Zionist partners teamed up with extremists and formed what's now known as the Religious Zionist Party. And so there's just all these small right-wing parties right now that lead to sort of inefficient vote distribution. You know, like if you were to count all the right-wing votes in the country, it would be like an overwhelming majority of the Knesset, but they still can't get their act together and form a coalition.
Okay, and so you do not expect Yamina to survive the coming elections?
I'm not sure they're even going to run in the coming election.
And if they do?
If they do, the polling shows them barely passing the threshold. They're passing, but only by like one seat.
Yeah, and the threshold again is a phenomenon which is not known in the Netherlands. We don't have it here, so maybe.
Yes, so to get into the Knesset, you have to get at least 3.25% of the vote, which is about 4 seats in the Knesset.
Yeah,
and if you get less than that, then you don't get into the Knesset.
And maybe for the understanding, if you translate it to the Netherlands, it would have been 5 seats in the Dutch Parliament, which has 150 seats.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe it's also interesting to remember that the Israeli parliament counts at the moment 13 parties. Dutch parliament has 21 parties at the moment.
Wow.
So
how do you, do your coalition, will your coalitions last longer than countries and they have less frequent elections?
And they have less parties at the moment, but we're still for Dutch way of thinking, this is very fragmented and the coalition has many parties. But the situation of having two bigger parties and all the others small is the same situation in the Netherlands as well. And that's quite interesting to remember. I often have the impression that Dutch people forget that. They look at Israel and they ask me, how comes they have that many parties? How comes they're so fragmented? And then I tell them, if you look at the Dutch parliament, we have a similar situation. And that's quite interesting to remember. Another thing, which is, in my opinion, some similarities exist, is the fact that there also in the Netherlands, there is a right-wing majority of parties. If you count all the parties, the right wing has a majority in parliament. I would like to go to the questions which were posed on the Q&A, and I will start with the first. What could be the external factor that would bring the Israeli people together to form a stable government?
You know, I saw that question in the box and I've been thinking about it. And the sad thing is I'm like not even sure what it could be, because last year we had a war in Gaza. And I don't think it united us that much. I mean, yes, the opposition was sort of quiet and not attacking Bibi for those, I think it was 11 days in total. But, you know, first of all, there was fighting, like actual violence, you can even call it pogroms, in mixed Jewish Arab cities inside Israel. It wasn't just between Israel and Gaza. So that's already disunity. But I just think even on like really important issues of national security right now, the language is really ugly between the opposition and coalition. You know, and of course the sides were reversed a year ago. You know, I think people still, the overwhelming majority of Israel, they still unite over supporting the IDF and supporting national security. And but I don't know that there's something that would actually stabilize our politics that comes from an external sort of threat.
But would you say that the decision of Gantz to join Bibi Netanyahu and the Likud in a government, to form a government, not in the last year, but in the
third election,
after the third election,
2020,
not an example of what you would call something that should unite the Israeli society?
Well, I mean, but it didn't, right? The government didn't last. It lasted less than a year, and in the end, they couldn't get along on political issues. It became very clear that Netanyahu wasn't planning to fulfill his promise and allow a rotation for Gantz to become prime minister after, you know, at the date that they had agreed on. And also Gantz was bringing up sort of new difficulties and challenges that didn't fit their agreement. So, you know, it's unfortunate. I just don't have like something that I think is going to be the magic bullet.
Is there a possibility that Netanyahu would step aside and there'd be another candidate, maybe outside of the Likud, maybe Yossi Cohen, running in the next elections?
The only way Netanyahu would step aside is for Likud to push him out. And right now, the support for him is really massive. As long as he has massive support, he has no reason to leave. And so, I mean, even when there was talk about a plea bargain, right, that in exchange for not going to prison for corruption, which, I mean, he could come off innocent again, the trial is ongoing, but there was an offer of him to have a plea bargain and he would resign as prime minister and then he would not have to go to prison, and he didn't agree to that.
Why do Netanyahu's trial take so long? Why isn't he in jail already?
Well, first of all, he might not be guilty, right? Some of the things that he's on trial for are sort of novel interpretations of the law that will have to really hold up in court, and there'll be a new legal precedent if he is convicted. And I think a lot of people don't realize that. But like things like, is positive coverage in the press considered a bribe? That's not something that has ever been, nobody's ever been convicted for that, you know? So it's interesting cases. Also, one of the cases, the one specifically pertaining to positive press coverage in Walla, which is like the second largest Hebrew news site in Israel. There's a lot of issues. The prosecution's having a lot of issues and their case is looking very weak. And so leaving aside the sort of new approach to bribery laws that the prosecution is pushing, there's just like a lot of inconsistencies in the story, and I don't know where that's going to go. On other cases, like the cases involving present gifts from Arnon Milchan, who's an Israeli Hollywood producer, there have been convictions that are not Netanyahu in the case. So that looks more sort of solid in terms of, but it doesn't necessarily mean Netanyahu will go to prison, right? Like you're convicted and there has to be sentencing. So I don't really have an answer to that. As far as why it's taking so long, there are 3 separate cases, and the justice system in Israel is very overloaded. When Netanyahu was still prime minister, he had a very busy schedule and the court was accommodating to him because he was prime minister. Now they're less accommodating. There's more court dates more frequently. You know, he's just opposition leader, but it takes time. It's taking a long time.
And if I may add, I don't think it takes that long. It's been on for a bit longer than a year now. The point is
that the indictment was 2.5 years ago almost.
Yeah, that was before that, but that was before the decision was taken to take him into court. And this is a different situation. He's not been trialed then yet. Would you say that the things that we see from the trial, which is going on now, are explaining better why the attorney has taken so long with the decision whether or not to take him to court?
I think part of it has to do with the fact that they're charging him on things that he hasn't been charged in the past. I think part of it is that they wanted the most ironclad. They wanted to feel really confident that they were going to have a conviction, because otherwise you're throwing the whole country into this really destabilizing situation of a prime minister, a sitting prime minister on trial, right? Like when Ehud Olmert was on trial, he had resigned, but there was no indication that Netanyahu was going to resign. So I think that that's part of why it took so long.
Who could at all challenge Netanyahu within his own party? Are there any figures which you see as potential followers or heirs of Netanyahu?
Two people have tried to challenge him since this endless cycle of elections began. One is Gideon Sa'ar. There was a primary. He only won about a quarter of the vote, and then he quit and formed his own party. The other is Yuli Edelstein, the former prisoner of Zion, right, former refusenik, and the former cabinet minister and speaker of the Knesset. And he said basically that, you know, we're in this cycle of election after election, and Netanyahu is not able to form a coalition, and therefore he should not continue leading the Likud. But there hasn't been any primary. You know, he made that announcement, I guess 9 months ago now. I think it was in September, and you know, nothing's really happened. So you know, the momentum is not on his side. You know, he was very prominent as Speaker of the Knesset, but time has passed since then. I think he's charismatic, and I think that in a normal race for leader of Likud, he would have a chance, but not sure that he has a good chance against Netanyahu, who just is so popular.
Do you have any explanation or theory about what makes Netanyahu that popular or that hated by other people?
And I think there's a lot of reasons he's popular. I think Israel had a very safe decade relative to the past. I think that a lot of voters came of age during the time of the Intifada and then the disengagement from Gaza, where Israel withdrawing from territory was met with a barrage of rockets, right, on the million residents of the northern Negev. And so people, many people, I mean, the majority in Israel clearly hold right-wing views when you look at public opinion polls. And many of them view Netanyahu as a sort of embodiment of a robust security position. You know, whether that translates into reality or not, that's definitely the image that he's built for himself and the image many people have of him. You know, and also in the 12 years that he was in power, Israel's economy did very, very well. The quality of life here improved by leaps and bounds. We had record low unemployment. The cost of living did rise a lot. And there was a lot, people were very unhappy about that. It's very hard to buy a house in Israel. But at the same time, I think overall, the Netanyahu years, those 12 years, were good years for a lot of people. And that made him popular. That in addition to just having charisma and political skill. Why do people not like him? Well, first of all, if you're left-wing, you won't like his policies, not on security issues, not on the Palestinians, not on economics, right? He is of the right, even though sometimes he has to compromise because not all of his political partners in his coalition are on the right, but that's certainly positions he holds. And some people see him as, you know, just like a very arrogant, slimy politician. You know, and if you don't like him, then rather than seeing the way he speaks as like, wow, he's charismatic, he's you know, a very skilled orator, you might see it as, oh, he's such a fake politician. And of course, there's the corruption, right? There's the fact that he is personally, what's the word? he just, you know, enjoys the good life. And some people in Israel maybe want a more modest leader.
So for some people, he's over the top.
Yes.
Yes. Somebody is asking, isn't it very bad what is happening to Israel now? What is your take on that?
Yeah, I mean, to paraphrase Ben Gurion, right? In Israel, to be a realist, you have to believe in miracles. And it's sort of like, somehow we got through the pandemic pretty well. Our economy, like relative to, you know, everyone's economy is hurting right now. It's like a bad time worldwide, but like relative to Europe and the US, our inflation isn't that high and our unemployment is pretty low. And somehow these things happen. But I think the political instability has really taken its toll. I think that there are things that could be better if we had a stable government, especially on the sort of socioeconomic front. And I think it's just been really ugly and corrosive to the sort of fabric of life in Israel, like as a society. I think that people are saying really ugly things to each other on social media over politics. People are less tolerant of dissenting views. And I think it's because we're constantly in the state of a campaign, right? When you have just a regular Knesset, then, okay, people disagree, but like you live your life. But when there's a campaign, the politicians are constantly everywhere, on social media, on TV, on the radio, espousing these views and sort of mudslinging against each other. And it just spreads negativity that like permeates into society. So yeah, I mean, I agree with you. I think it's really bad. And I think we need stability.
Yeah, the question is how. So maybe it could be interesting to take a tour about the people, the other politicians who are in the picture at the moment. Maybe you could just name a few of them. And somebody is specifically asking about Ayelet Shaked.
Okay, so I'll start with Ayelet Shaked. Several years ago, I think it was 2016 or 2015, I wrote an article for Tablet magazine, if you're familiar. It's with a Jewish sort of interest news site. They proposed a question to me that if Israel were to have a female prime minister, who would it be? And my answer basically was Ayelet Shaked was the most likely candidate. She was a rising star. She was justice minister who had enacted really popular reforms. People really loved her. She was secular, but in a religious right-wing party. Even though she wasn't in Likud, people in Likud really loved her and were trying to win her over onto their party. Netanyahu doesn't like her, but he doesn't like anyone. You know, she looked like she had a really promising future. But she seemed to have hitched her horse too tightly to Bennett. They were, you know, like a team constantly working together. And I mean, Bennett became prime minister, so I can't say he's not successful, but it didn't work for her. Her star has been fading. And for the past, I don't know, year and a half or so, it's like she hasn't been able to shine. She hasn't had that much to do. And I remember that she's very capable. I mean, whether you agree with her or not, she is someone who is very capable, but she's not doing so great politically. So that's Ayelet Shaked. Now, look, there's 120 members of Knesset, so I'll talk about Yair Lapid, because I don't even know if I mentioned him, and he's very important. So Yair Lapid is the head of the second biggest party in the Knesset, which is the Yesh Atid party. And as of either late tonight or early tomorrow, he is expected to be Israel's prime minister. So his party, Yesh Atid, which I'll get into what they stand for, they are the largest party in the coalition that's about to be kaput within hours. And and he had an agreement with Bennett for a rotation for prime minister. So in theory, if this government hadn't fallen apart, he would have become prime minister next summer. But another element of the agreement is that if the coalition breaks up, then he becomes the prime minister of the interim government. So the government from now until the next, from the time an election is called until the next government is formed. So if Israel is lucky and we only have one election now and then government, he will be either prime minister until January, or he will be the elected prime, and then he could either be the elected prime minister of the next government or someone else. I mean, likely the alternative is Netanyahu. So then Netanyahu or him would become prime minister of a regular, not interim government. If we have another election, then he will remain prime minister for 2-3 elections, God forbid, as the prime minister of the interim government. So anyway, Lapid is a really interesting and colorful figure. He comes from a very famous literary and journalistic family in Israel, and his father, Tommy Lapid, who was a very prominent journalist, then was Israel's justice minister in the beginning of the 21st century. And Tommy Lapid, the father, is a Holocaust survivor also, but he's was very famous for being a secularist, for being very anti-Haredi, and for wanting to pass all kinds of laws to sort of liberalize the situation and separate religion and state in Israel. Lapid has taken some of that on. He initially in politics had a similar attitude, very negative attitude towards the Haredim. I don't know what's in his heart of hearts, but he's learned that politically baiting and constantly arguing with the Haredim is not actually that helpful to anyone. So he stopped doing that as much, but he still wants massive reforms and sort of liberalization in religion and state. And overall, for most of his decade in politics, he's been very focused on domestic issues. Again, religion and state, social affairs, economics, and things like that. In recent years, he became more interested in foreign relations, and he's now Israel's foreign minister. Now he's, you know what, I talked about his family and I forgot to talk about him. So he was a TV star and just a cultural figure in so many ways, mostly known as a journalist. He was a TV host and he wrote a weekly column for newspapers for 30 years. But he's also acted. He's also written screenplays. He's also written songs that became popular hits in Israel. He doesn't sing, but he's written the lyrics. So he's really just was one of the most famous Israelis, one of the biggest celebrity in Israel before he ran for politics. And he's very charismatic, but also one of these people who's polarizing, like Netanyahu, where you could see him as charismatic or you could see him as arrogant and a fake politician. And I hear both from people. But as foreign minister, let's say he really knows how to like have that look and, you know, charm people and put like a good face of Israel forward. In most cases, he got into a pretty terrible fight with Poland that you may have heard of. But overall, I think that he's improved relations with the EU. He's helped sort of improve relations with the Democratic Party in the US. He has, what's rare, although not unheard of for an Israeli prime minister, is that he really has no experience in the national security sphere. So in the army, he was a journalist, and he never, you know, served in any real operational security capacity. He's been a member of the security cabinet for the last year. And when he was a cabinet minister between 2013 and 2015, he was the security cabinet, but that's the most of his security experience. So that's also something that people are sort of concerned about with him.
Our time is almost over. So somebody is asking if you see any similarity between Lapid and Zelensky.
Lapid and Zelensky. It's an interesting question. Lapid prefers to compare himself to Macron because they both sort of founded this like centrist party, you know, coming from out of nowhere that's had a meteoric rise. And they both started out in politics as well. I believe that Macron was the economics minister, which is not the same as finance, but Lapid was finance minister. So they actually knew each other from back then, from 10 years ago. But look, Zelensky was a comedian. I mean, clearly very intelligent. I believe he also had a law degree, but like he was a comedian. Whereas Lapid for 30 years wrote a weekly column in the newspaper. And it wasn't like, sometimes he wrote about, I don't know, sports or things like that. But overall, like he wrote about politics and he wrote about the everyday issues concerning Israelis. So it wasn't like and he came from a political family. So it wasn't out of nowhere the way Zelensky is.
Yeah.
I will say, look, I guess Zelensky surprised people at how tough he could be in this war. And people talk about Lapid like people who don't like him talk about him as he's superficial and he's an empty suit, etc. But he's stood up for Israel's interests in the past year. And just for example, he really made it one of his priorities to improve relations with the EU, which he felt had, at least the sort of Western Europe countries in the EU, he felt that those relationships had deteriorated in recent years and he wanted to improve them. But earlier this week, when Borrell announced that there would be a return to Iran talks, he was very, very firm with Borrell and said that this is putting Israel in danger and this is a terrible idea, that you're falling into a trap of Iran's. And so I do think that he is tough or knows when to be tough. I personally have been like, in my assessment, like I was, he was tougher than I expected in this case and in other cases. But, Zelensky is he's been challenged in a way that, frankly, I hope we're not challenged in Israel anytime soon.
Yeah. But that's interesting. It's an interesting idea which was posed. Yeah. So I thought it's interesting to discuss this. Time has come to an end. It's 9 o'clock already. So I want to thank you very, very much for this very interesting and clear overview of Israeli politics and where we are heading. The elections will be either the 25th of October or the 1st of November, probably. That is very soon. And we know some parties will hold their primaries beforehand, like the Likud, like the Labour Party. They've already announced, and probably some other parties. Lapid's party does not hold any primaries. Lapid selects his candidates for the Knesset. So we will have to wait and see what will happen next. I want to thank you very much, Lahav. I want to thank our audience, and I want to remind you that you're welcome to come and visit our website with a lot of more information about some of the issues that have been discussed, and of course, many issues that will come up in the coming period. You're mostly welcome to follow us, and of course, very, very welcome to support us. And you can also register to subscribe to our newsletter, either the weekly or the daily. This lecture has been recorded, and it will be available soon for whoever wants to share it with other people. I wish everybody a very nice evening. I wish Israel successful election period and elections, and I hope that they will be able to get out of this impasse they are in at the moment. And we will all follow this very carefully. Thank you all very much, and a very good evening to us all.